It's Flashcards Friday, and I'm your host, Gabrielle Birchak. In Tuesday's episode, I talked about Mari Wolf, a science fiction writer in the 1950s. She was also a mathematician who worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. As a brilliant and creative individual, Mari's story reminds us that science needs science fiction. Science fiction gives us a safe place to pressure test big ideas before the real world has to absorb the risk. With that said, I'm going to borrow 3 moments from Star Trek to answer a question that sounds playful, but it is seriously useful. What can science learn from science fiction? But first, a quick word from my advertisers. Science fiction is not valuable because it predicts the future. It is valuable because it trains the mind. It gives us a way to practice thinking about systems before we build them, and to practice caring about consequences before consequences have real names. Today's episode comes in 3 flashcards. Science fiction helps science by stress testing ideas, previewing consequences, and building shared language. And I'm going to be using Star Trek scenarios as my examples because sometimes the strangest episodes are the best teachers. Flashcard number 1, science fiction stress tests ideas. Engineers and scientists run stress tests because reality is never polite. A system does not fail only in the ways you expect. It fails in the ways you forgot to imagine, and sometimes it fails in the ways you could not imagine until you saw them happen. That is where sci-fi shines. It creates extreme scenarios that force you to ask, what breaks first? And what did everyone assume would never happen? And this brings us to one of Star Trek original series' most infamous episodes, Spock's Brain. If you've never seen it, the premise is spectacularly ridiculous. Spock's brain is literally stolen. Not metaphorically, not psychologically. It is physically removed from his body and carried off as if a brain were a device someone could borrow, like a toolkit. The Enterprise crew is forced to confront an impossible failure mode. They have a colleague whose body is alive, but whose mind has been taken away, and they have to function under a situation that makes no sense. And that is precisely why it works as a teaching tool. Stress testing is not about what is likely. It is about what is catastrophic. In the real world, nobody expects the brain of a system to be removed in a clean, dramatic theft. However, critical components do disappear in other ways. A key data set becomes corrupted, a vital team member leaves, a central server goes down, a supply chain snaps, a dependency fails, a hidden assumption turns out to be wrong. When that happens, the question becomes immediate. Can the system still operate safely? Spock's brain is an exaggerated version of a real engineering habit. You look at the part of the system you rely on most, and you imagine it gone. Then you ask, what happens next? Do you have redundancy? Do you have fallback? Do you have a plan that does not depend on everything working perfectly? The episode is absurd, but it exposes something sober. Many systems appear stable only because no one has tried to stress them at their weakest point. Star Trek takes a problem that would normally be a checklist and turns it into a crisis you can hear in your pulse. Flashcard number 2, science fiction previews consequences. Science isn't only about discovery. Science is deployment. A new idea is thrilling in a lab. It becomes complicated when it enters a world filled with incentives, shortcuts, power, fear, and ordinary human habits. Science fiction is good at previewing consequences because it refuses to stop at can we? And insists on asking what happens after. For that, I'm going to use a beloved episode from the original series called The Trouble with Tribbles. In that story, Tribbles are cute, furry, harmless-looking creatures. They coo, they purr, they seem like the kind of thing a tired crew member might want to hold after a long shift. Then they reproduce, and reproduce, and reproduce. Soon the ship is full of them. Storage compartments are overflowing. Food supplies are threatened. The Tribbles become an ecological and logistical disaster, and the episode plays it for laughs because watching a dignified officer played by William Shatner is funny when he's buried under a wave of fluff. But underneath the comedy is a sharp lesson about systems. Many problems do not arrive as villains. They arrive as harmless variables. They arrive as small additions nobody thinks through. They arrive as conveniences. They arrive as a cute solution to boredom. Like the employee who accidentally downloaded legit-looking software, also known as the after-hours spicy websites, the internet's red light district, the forbidden pop-up kingdom, which actually turned out to be malware and ended up taking down an entire network. I'm looking at you, Disney. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes boredom can ruin an entire business. But in science, this happens in a different way. A new species is introduced and it becomes invasive. A chemical seems safe until it accumulates. A technology seems beneficial until it becomes ubiquitous. And AI seems demonstrative once it starts to deplete our water sources. A design choice seems minor until it shapes behavior at scale. The Trouble with Tribbles is a story about exponential growth and unplanned cascades. The episode is about how quickly a system can tip when something that looks small starts multiplying. And because it's funny, it slips the lesson into you without tensing up. You laugh. Then you realize you have witnessed a perfect demonstration of unintended consequences. They show how systems can spiral when something small becomes something unstoppable. In Star Trek, the consequences arrive fast, but in real life, they arrive slowly, which makes them easier to ignore. Flashcard number 3, science fiction builds shared language. This flashcard is a little quieter, but it might be the most important of the 3. Science depends on shared language. People need a way to describe what they are trying to build. They need metaphors, models, and names that help collaborators coordinate. They need concepts that can move from one mind to another without collapsing on the way. Without that, even brilliant ideas stall. And this brings us to one of the finest episodes of The Next Generation, Darmok. In Darmok, the Enterprise encounters a species whose language does not function in the usual way. The universal translator can translate the words, but it can't decipher the meaning because the meaning is carried through shared references and metaphors. The Tamarian captain speaks in stories. He says things like Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, and without cultural context, it sounds like nonsense. Yet, for his people, the phrase carries a whole situation, an emotional memory, a shared map of meaning. And as Captain Picard struggles to communicate, the episode reveals something very important. Vocabulary is not just words. Vocabulary is a shared history of images. And science works the same way. When scientists share a metaphor, they share a shortcut for understanding. When they share a model, they share a way to reason. When they share a term, they agree on what matters. And that is why fields accelerate when they find the correct language. The language lets teams align. It allows research questions to become visible. It enables people to point at the same concept and know they are pointing at the same thing. Darmok makes that literal. It turns communication into survival. It shows that even the best tools fail when there is no shared meaning behind the words. And it also offers something emotionally helpful. The episode insists that shared language can be built. It's not magic. It's not automatic. It's created through effort, patience, and the willingness to meet someone else where they are. Picard and Dathon find a way to communicate by building a shared story in real time. This is a beautiful metaphor for science at its best. Science is a communal project. It advances when people share not only data, but meaning. A shared language can be the difference between a brilliant idea that dies in someone's notebook and a clever idea that becomes a project. To conclude, here is what science can learn from science fiction. First, science fiction stress tests ideas. Spock's brain forces a wild failure mode into the open and asks what a system does when its critical component is suddenly gone. Second, science fiction previews consequences. The Trouble with Tribbles turns exponential growth into comedy, and Genesis turns unforeseen biological collapse into dread. Still, both show how quickly systems can spiral out of control. Third, science fiction builds shared language. Darmok shows that words without shared meaning are noise, and that shared stories can become bridges that make cooperation possible. The next time you watch a science fiction episode or read a science fiction story, I want you to ask 3 questions that scientists ask, even if they don't always say them out loud. First, what is this story stress testing? What does it remove, break, or exaggerate to reveal the system underneath? Second, what consequences does it preview? Who benefits? Who carries the risk? And what grows out of control when nobody pays attention early? Third, what language does it give us? What metaphor, term, or shared image helps people talk about a new possibility as if it were thinkable? Those questions are not only for writers and viewers. They are for anyone who lives in a world shaped by technology. Science fiction does not need to be correct to be useful. It needs to be clear about what it is testing. And when it is clear, it becomes more than a story. It becomes practice. Thank you for listening to Math Science History. And until next time, live long and prosper, my friends.